You'd think life in suburban Los Angeles would be anything but predictable, but for me, it was as routine as the tide coming in. I had my morning tea on the porch, a quiet nod to my late husband, Richard, who used to joke that I was married to my chamomile. 5 years had passed since he was gone, and my world had shrunk to the size of my backyard garden, a few dusty books, and an occasional chat with neighbors about the weather. That was until the day everything shifted, unexpectedly, and all at once. It started with the bang of a garbage truck slamming the bins down on the curb, jolting me from my book. I sighed, adjusting my sweater against the chilly breeze, when I noticed Daniel Monroe stepping out of his house. He was mid-40s, with a presence that made you notice him even if you weren't trying to. Dressed in a casual button-up and jeans, he moved with purpose, but had an air of distraction. I'd seen him 1,000 times before, but this time, something about him caught my attention. Before I could dwell on it, the sound of a car screeching to a halt in the street pulled my focus. A delivery van had narrowly avoided hitting a cyclist, and I found myself on my feet, heart pounding as the two men exchanged heated words. The neighborhood rarely saw drama like this, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Daniel stepped out onto his lawn, his brows furrowed as he watched the commotion. "Crazy out here today, huh?" His voice carried over as he walked toward me. "I was just thinking the same," I replied, offering a small smile. Before I could say more, a knock echoed from my front door. I frowned. Visitors were rare. Daniel tilted his head. "You expecting anyone?" "No," I turned, my heart skipping for reasons I couldn't explain, and opened the door to a young man in a uniform holding a package I hadn't ordered. "Delivery for Claire Andrews?" "That's me, but I didn't order." "Probably a mix-up," Daniel chimed in, now standing closer. "Let me check the address." While the delivery guy fumbled with his device, Daniel took the opportunity to glance at the label. "It's not yours," he confirmed, handing it back with a sheepish smile. The delivery man apologized and left, but Daniel lingered, an unspoken tension in the air. "Speaking of things you didn't expect," he began, his voice softer now, "can I talk to you about something?" My curiosity piqued. "Of course."
"Come in."
Inside, Daniel paced my living room like he was searching for the right words. "It's about my sister, Emily. She's staying with me for a while, going through a divorce. It's messy, Claire. Really messy." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, sitting down and gesturing for him to do the same. He remained standing, hands on his hips, looking out the window like the answers were somewhere in the hydrangeas. "I don't know how to help her," he admitted. "She's always been so strong, but this has broken her." The words hung heavy in the room. "You've been through so much," he said, turning to face me. "Losing Richard, building this life on your own, it's inspiring. I think you could help her."
"Talk to her, maybe."
"Show her there's light at the end of this." His words caught me off guard. "Me? I'm not sure I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person," he cut in, his voice firm but gentle. "You've survived heartbreak and found a way to keep going. She needs that hope. And honestly, I could use it too." The rawness in his voice made my breath hitch. For a man who always seemed confident, this vulnerability was unexpected. "I'll do it," I said after a long pause. "If you think I can help, I'll try." Relief washed over his face, and for a moment, we shared a quiet understanding. He started to thank me, but was interrupted by the distant wail of a car alarm. "What now?" he muttered, peering out the window. Down the street, someone was chasing after a runaway dog that had triggered the alarm. Daniel chuckled. "It's chaos today, isn't it?" "Feels like the universe is restless," I replied, though my mind was elsewhere. Later that evening, after we'd made arrangements for Emily to visit, I stood on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. Daniel lingered across the lawn, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. He waved before heading inside, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something unexpected. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something real, something alive. And just like that, the quiet I'd come to depend on was cracked wide open. It started with quick visits, Daniel stopping by to finalize details about Emily's arrival. At first, the conversations were practical. What days worked best, whether Emily preferred tea or coffee, what kind of books she enjoyed. But as the days unfolded, those quick visits turned into long talks that stretched into the evening, their topics growing more personal with each passing day. One afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced, holding a small pot of lavender. "Thought this might brighten up the place," he said with a sheepish smile, setting it on my porch railing. I laughed. "Bringing plants now? You're either buttering me up or redecorating." "Maybe both," he admitted, shrugging. "Emily used to grow these in her garden before things fell apart. I figured it might make her feel more at home." There it was again, that quiet care he carried for his sister. It was impossible not to admire. We sat on the porch that day, and for the first time, Daniel talked about his life. He told me about his career in real estate, his dreams of opening a boutique firm someday, and how he'd once driven cross-country just to see the Grand Canyon at sunrise. But it wasn't all lighthearted. He also confessed how hard it was to watch his sister unravel after her marriage fell apart. "It's like she's not even herself anymore," he said, his voice heavy. "Emily was always the strong one. Now, she won't even look me in the eye some days." "You're doing everything you can," I reassured him. "Sometimes just being there is enough." He gave me a look, one that lingered just a little too long. "Sometimes, Claire, I think you understand me better than anyone I've ever met." The words sent a ripple through me, but I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. By the time Emily arrived that weekend, I felt like I already knew her. She was younger than I expected, with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor that spoke volumes. Her first words to me were hesitant, almost apologetic. "Daniel said you were kind," she murmured as I ushered her inside. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I think he's right. We spent the afternoon in the garden. She admired the lavender Daniel had brought, running her fingers over the delicate flowers. We talked about everything and nothing, her favorite novels, the chaos of her divorce, and the dreams she once had for a family. As the sun dipped low, Emily leaned back in her chair and sighed. "It's been so long since I felt normal. Like myself." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a fragile kind of hope. "Thank you, Claire, for listening, for making me feel like I'm not broken." Her gratitude was genuine, but as Daniel arrived to check on her, I couldn't help but notice the way his attention shifted. He asked Emily how she was, but his eyes flicked to me more often than not. That evening, after Emily went to bed, Daniel stayed behind on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. We sat side by side, watching the stars slowly emerge in the darkening sky. "Emily seems lighter," he said after a while. "She's finding her way," I replied. "She just needs time and someone to remind her she's not alone." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You're good at that, you know. Reminding people they're not alone." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. The air between us felt charged, and I could feel my pulse quicken as his gaze held mine. "Daniel," I started, but the words caught in my throat. He smiled then, a soft, almost wistful smile. "Good night, Claire." As he stood to leave, I caught myself wanting to reach out, to ask him to stay. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the stars and wondering what had just shifted between us, and why it felt so impossible to ignore. The following week was filled with more of Daniel's visits. At first, they seemed casual. He'd stop by with updates about Emily or bring over fresh produce from the farmer's market. But something about these visits felt different. His tone was lighter, more personal. He laughed more easily, lingered longer. One evening, he arrived with a bottle of wine in hand. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, holding it up like an offering. I didn't realize I was the lucky recipient of your wine expertise, I teased, stepping aside to let him in. He chuckled, setting the bottle on the counter. Well, consider it a thank you gift for everything you're doing for Emily. The way he said it, though, made me pause. There was something in his voice that hinted at more than just gratitude. We opened the bottle and settled into the living room, the golden light of the evening filtering through the windows. As we talked, the conversation wandered, as it often did, from light-hearted banter to deeper confessions. I need to tell you something, Daniel said suddenly, his voice dropping. I looked up, caught off guard by the shift in his tone. What is it? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. These visits, they aren't just about Emily. The air in the room seemed to still. My heart gave an unsteady thud as I waited for him to continue. At first, that's what I told myself, he admitted, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. But the truth is, I keep coming back because of you, Claire. I blinked, the words hitting me like a sudden gust of wind. Me? He nodded, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. You're incredible. Strong, kind, funny. Every time I'm around you, I feel like I can breathe again. Like the world isn't so heavy. My chest tightened, a mix of emotions flooding through me, shock, confusion, and something warm and fluttering that I hadn't felt in years. Daniel, my voice faltered, unsure of what to say. I know this might be out of line, he continued quickly, as though afraid I might stop him. And I know it's unexpected, but I had to tell you. Because if I didn't... He stopped mid-sentence as the sound of footsteps approached from the hallway. Emily appeared in the doorway, her expression surprised but not unkind. Oh, sorry, she said, glancing between us. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted some tea. The moment shattered, and I felt a rush of relief and disappointment all at once. Daniel sat back, clearing his throat.
No.
You're fine, Emily. We were just talking. Emily gave us a small smile before heading to the kitchen, leaving a trail of silence in her wake. I avoided Daniel's gaze, my mind racing. After a moment, he stood, running a hand along the back of his neck. I should go, he said softly. Daniel. He turned, his eyes meeting mine one last time. Good night, Claire. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of his confession and the realization that my heart was racing in a way I hadn't allowed it to in far too long. As I sat there, the faint sound of Emily stirring in the kitchen grounding me, one thought became clear. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The invitation to dinner came a few days after Daniel's confession, and I couldn't shake the nerves as I set the table. It wasn't fancy, just roasted chicken, a bottle of Pinot Noir, and candles I'd pulled from the back of a cabinet. Yet, the simplicity of it all felt intimate in a way that made my hands tremble as I lit the wicks. When Daniel arrived, there was a moment of awkwardness as we exchanged pleasantries, both of us clearly aware of the weight lingering from our last conversation. But as the evening unfolded, the tension melted away, replaced by the ease that always seemed to accompany him. We talked about everything, the mess of Emily's divorce, the latest ridiculous neighborhood drama, something about Mr. Carter's lawn gnome mysteriously disappearing, and even old stories from Daniel's college days. Laughter filled the room, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to lighthearted. As the meal wound down, Daniel leaned back in his chair, cradling his wine glass. His usual confidence seemed to waver as he stared at the amber glow of the candles. There's something about nights like this, he said softly. They remind me of how life used to feel before everything got complicated. I tilted my head, watching him closely. What do you mean? He hesitated, then took a sip of wine, as if steeling himself. I mean, I never thought I'd feel this way again.
Happy.
Or even close to it. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Daniel wasn't the type to open up easily, and hearing the cracks in his usual composure stirred something in me. "I know what you mean," I admitted. For a long time after Richard passed, I told myself that this quiet, simple life was all I could ever have, that I shouldn't expect anything more. He looked at me then, his eyes soft but searching. "Do you still feel that way?" I hesitated. The answer caught somewhere between my heart and my throat. "I'm not sure. Sometimes I think, maybe it's not too late to feel something more." Daniel leaned forward, setting his glass down as his gaze locked with mine. "It's not," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "It's never too late, Claire." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, almost as if he couldn't stop himself, Daniel reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, almost tentative, but it sent a wave of warmth coursing through me. I looked down at our hands, my breath hitching as I realized how natural it felt. How right. When I finally looked up, his expression was raw, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "Claire," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say more, the faint sound of Emily's footsteps echoed from the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the scene. "Oh," she said, clearly caught off guard. I didn't mean to interrupt. "I just wanted some water." Daniel quickly pulled his hand back, the moment broken as Emily stepped into the kitchen. I could feel my cheeks flush, the weight of what had just happened settling over me like a heavy blanket. As Emily poured herself a glass of water, Daniel stood, clearing his throat. "I should probably head out," he said, avoiding my gaze. I followed him to the door, my mind racing with everything left unsaid. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Claire," he said softly. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the night. When I closed the door, I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart. Something had shifted between us, something undeniable. And despite the uncertainty, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. I couldn't sleep after that dinner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's hand brushing against mine, his eyes soft and searching, his words echoing in my mind. "It's never too late, Claire." But was it? The next morning, I stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood come alive. Birds flitted between the trees, a jogger passed by, and Mrs. Hargrove walked her yapping terrier. It was all so familiar, so normal, but inside, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. For years, I'd kept my heart in a box, locked up tight with memories of Richard. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. And now, Daniel had come along and shaken everything loose. I spent the day trying to focus on mundane tasks, pulling weeds in the garden, reorganizing the pantry, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. By the time the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the questions swirling in my mind. Later that evening, as I stood on the porch watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, Claire." I turned to see Daniel standing at the edge of my yard, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He looked hesitant, almost shy, a far cry from the confident man I thought I knew. "Hi, Daniel," I said, my voice soft. "Everything okay?" "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a walk," he said, nodding toward the quiet street. "It's a beautiful evening." I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Let me grab my jacket." We walked in silence at first, the sound of our footsteps filling the space between us. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine, and the distant hum of the city felt miles away. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night. At dinner." I glanced at him, my heart skipping a beat. "Oh." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I meant it, Claire. Every word. These past few weeks, spending time with you, it's made me realize things about myself. About what I want." His words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. Daniel, He stopped walking then, turning to face me. His expression was raw, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. I love you, Claire. I know it might sound crazy, and I know you've been through so much, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. You've brought something back into my life I thought I'd lost forever. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, his words landing with the weight of 1,000 questions. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My chest felt tight, my thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and longing. Daniel, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can. He stepped closer, his hands moving slightly as if he wanted to reach for me, but wasn't sure if he should. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. We stood there under the soft glow of a street lamp, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. I could feel the warmth of his presence, the sincerity in his words, and the quiet hope in his eyes. But I also felt the weight of my own fear, the fear of opening my heart again, of risking the pain I'd spent so many years burying. I need time, I whispered, my voice trembling. Daniel nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with sadness. Take all the time you need, Claire. I'm not going anywhere. As we continued our walk back to the house, the silence between us felt different, heavier, yet filled with possibilities. When we reached my porch, Daniel paused at the bottom of the steps. Good night, Claire, he said softly. Good night, Daniel, I replied, watching as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his confession settling over me like a storm cloud. And as I looked out into the quiet night, one question echoed louder than all the others. Was I brave enough to let him in? It had been days since Daniel's confession, and his words still played on a loop in my mind. I love you, Claire. How could 3 simple words feel so heavy, so life-altering? Every time I replayed the moment, my heart raced, but so did my doubts. What if I wasn't ready? What if I never would be? But as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the text message I'd just sent inviting him to dinner, I realized there was no turning back. By the time Daniel arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting a warm, golden light over the porch. He stood at the door with a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of daisies in the other. I wasn't sure if these were your favorite, he said, a shy smile tugging at his lips. They're perfect, I replied, taking the flowers and stepping aside to let him in. The atmosphere felt charged from the start, our movements careful, our words layered with unspoken meaning. The dinner table was set simply, but the flickering candlelight made it feel more intimate than I'd intended. As we ate, the conversation drifted from Emily's progress to our shared memories of the neighborhood, to the little quirks that made us laugh. But beneath it all, there was a quiet tension, a sense that we were both waiting for the inevitable. At one point, Daniel set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. You've been quiet tonight, he said softly. What's on your mind? I hesitated, my fingers brushing the rim of my glass. A lot, honestly. About us. About what you said the other night. He straightened slightly, his expression cautious but hopeful. And I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. And I'm scared, Daniel. But I'm also tired of being scared. I don't know what the future looks like, but I don't want to let that stop me anymore. His gaze softened, and the faintest smile appeared on his face. You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that. We cleared the table together, our movements easy, almost instinctive. But as we stood side by side at the sink, the distance between us seemed to vanish. When the last dish was put away, Daniel turned to me, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Claire, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could think, before I could second-guess myself, I closed the gap between us. His lips met mine, tentative at first, then deepening as the world seemed to fall away. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, certain, and filled with everything we hadn't said. When we finally pulled apart, I could feel my cheeks flush, and I avoided his gaze, embarrassed by my own boldness. But Daniel didn't move away. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he admitted, his voice low. "Me too," I said, my heart pounding. But before we could savor the moment, a shadow flickered outside the window. My breath caught as I turned to see Mrs. Hargrove, the neighborhood's most notorious gossip, walking her dog past the house. She glanced toward the window, her steps slowing just enough to make my stomach sink. Daniel followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" "Mrs. Hargrove," I said, my voice tight. "If she saw us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"So, what if she did?"
"Claire, we're not doing anything wrong." "I know," I said, my chest tightening. "But this neighborhood people talk, Daniel. And I'm not sure I'm ready to be the subject of their whispers." He took a step closer, his hands gently resting on my shoulders. "Let them talk," he said firmly. "I don't care about them. I care about you." His words steadied me, but the fear lingered. As I walked him to the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had been perfect and fragile all at once, like a delicate thread that could unravel with the slightest pull. "Good night, Claire," Daniel said, his voice soft but sure. "Good night," I replied, watching him disappear into the night. As I closed the door, my thoughts raced. The kiss had changed everything. But in our little neighborhood, where every glance and whisper carried weight, I couldn't help but wonder, had we crossed a line we couldn't uncross? It didn't take long for the whispers to start. I could feel them even before I heard them. The sideways glances at the grocery store, the sudden pauses in conversation when I walked into the room. In a neighborhood as tight-knit as ours, privacy was a fleeting luxury, and Daniel and I had unwittingly become the newest topic of discussion. It started innocently enough. Mr. Carter, with his ever-present rake, made a passing comment as I walked past his yard one morning. "You've been looking happier lately, Claire," he said, his tone almost teasing. "I wonder why that is." I forced a smile, brushing it off, but the unease followed me home. By the time I ran into Mrs. Hargrove at the coffee shop 2 days later, the undertones were impossible to ignore. "Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" she said, stirring her tea with exaggerated nonchalance. "I saw Daniel leaving your house the other night. You two must be quite close." There it was, the veiled judgment, the knowing smirk. My stomach twisted as I mumbled something vague and hurried out, her eyes burning into my back. The next day, Daniel showed up at my door, his usual warm smile dimmed by concern. "Claire, we need to talk," he said as I let him in. He sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "I heard from Emily," he began, his voice steady but tense. "She said someone asked her outright if we were seeing each other." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as his words settled over me. "And what did she say?" "She told them it wasn't anyone's business," he replied, looking up at me. "But Claire, this is getting out of hand. People are watching us, talking about us." "I know," I said, sinking into the chair across from him. "I can feel it everywhere I go. It's like they're waiting for me to trip, to confirm whatever they think they know." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest.
"So, what if they know?"
"Claire, we haven't done anything wrong. We're two adults who care about each other. Why does it matter what they think?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the word stuck. Why did it matter? Was it because I'd spent years crafting a quiet, respectable life after Richard's death? Or was it because the idea of being judged, of being the subject of endless gossip, terrified me? Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. Daniel and I exchanged a glance, the tension between us sharpening. When I opened the door, I found Mr. Carter standing there, his expression unreadable. "Sorry to bother you," he said, glancing past me into the house. But I thought you should know, people are talking. And not kindly. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady. I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at, Mr. Carter. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Look, Claire, I don't care what you do in your private life. But in a place like this, reputations stick. Just be careful, okay? I closed the door slowly after he left, my hands trembling. When I turned back to Daniel, he was already on his feet, his jaw tight with frustration. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. Why should we have to justify ourselves to anyone? Because this is where I live, Daniel. I shot back, my own voice sharper than I intended. These are the people I see every day, the people who know everything about my life. If this turns into some scandal, I'll be the one living with the fallout, not you. The words hung in the air, heavy and unkind. Daniel's expression softened, the fight draining out of him. I'm sorry, he said after a long pause. That's not what I want for you. But Claire, you have to decide. Do you care more about what they think, or about what we could have? His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over everything I'd been trying to hold steady. He was right, this was a choice, and there was no middle ground. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice trembling. Daniel took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. Then tell me, Claire.
Right now.
If this isn't what you want, I'll walk away. But if there's even a part of you that believes in us, please, don't let them take this from us. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, every emotion warring inside. I opened my mouth, my heart pounding as the words began to form. And then there was another knock at the door.